Okay, looks like we've got a pretty good group of folks signed on. So I think we'll go ahead and start. Welcome everyone to today's webinar on PFAS. My name is Kevin Ruther. I am the Chief Legal Officer and Deputy Director here at the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, MCEA. We are really happy that you're able to join us today. Thanks for being here. If you are new to MCEA, we're the leading legal and policy organization working to protect Minnesota's environment and the health of its people. We work on a wide variety of issues, from groundwater contamination due to ag practices in southern Minnesota to urban industry pollution and land use in environmental justice communities here in the city. We work to protect our waters and communities in northern Minnesota from mining pollution. And of course, we're fighting hard for policies here in St. Paul to address climate change. Today, we're here to talk about an issue that is an emerging concern, and that's contamination of our waters and our lands with forever chemicals known as PFAS. With us today are Carly Griffith from MCEA. Hi, Carly. And Professor Matt Simcik of the University of Minnesota. Thanks for being here, Matt. Carly is MCEA's Water Program Director, where she leads our team of lawyers and policy advocates to address the many threats to Minnesota's waters and to public health. Carly has a master's degree from Brown and is completing her PhD currently in geography at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Simcik is a professor in the Division of Environmental Health Sciences in the School of Public Health at the University of Minnesota. He obtained his undergrad in chemistry from Michigan State, his master's degree in civil engineering from the University of Minnesota, and his PhD in environmental science from Rutgers. He studies the fate and transport of organic contaminants, and for the past 20-some years has focused on PFAS. So he's our expert in the room today. In conjunction with this webinar, we are publishing a report that Carly and Matt authored, along with MCEA attorneys Jay Eidsness and Heidi Gunther. The report is called Forever Chemicals in Our Wastewater, and you'll be able to access that report on our website, which is www.mncenter.org, after the webinar. So what we have planned today is, first of all, we have an hour set aside. We want to cover 4 things and then leave time for your questions. So the first is we want to give an introduction and a little bit of background to PFAS. What are they? Why do we care about them? Second, we want to talk about the regulatory regime, what's happening at the state and federal level in our administrative agencies to regulate these pollutants. Third, Matt conducted a study over the summer on PFAS in Minnesota, and so we want to talk about that, see what those results are. And then fourth, we have some recommendations for future action, and we want to spend some time looking at those recommendations. So I think we'll just get started, and I want to start with you, Matt, since you're the expert, to give us a little bit of background on what PFAS are, how we got to where we are, why they were ever even created.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. So the idea behind PFAS is it's an acronym which stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. Essentially, what the scientific community originally termed PFAS are a group of chemicals where they've had all or almost all of the hydrogens replaced with fluorines in organic molecules. And these things have been used in a myriad of applications as surface active molecules where they can create a foam to put out fires, to stain and water protectants on clothing and carpeting and textiles, to waterproofing and oil-proofing food wrappers. And so the uses are, as I mentioned, multifold. They've been in use since the 50s and 60s, and they have garnered attention because originally they weren't thought to go anywhere based on what we knew of the environmental chemistry of them. And in the early 2000s, late 1990s, people started discovering these chemicals everywhere where we didn't expect them to be. And so we started playing catch up on, okay, what are these chemicals, where are they going, and what kinds of things are they doing in the environment?
Great. Carly, why do we care now about PFAS and the fact that they're everywhere in our environment?
So, like Dr. Simcik said, the very same qualities that make PFAS substances a prized chemical for industrial uses also makes them very persistent in the environment. So they remain stable, they don't degrade, and they don't break down. So there are many ways that humans can be exposed to PFAS because of that persistence, through the water we drink, through the fish we eat, even through the air. But one of the primary pathways where humans are exposed to PFAS is through the water we drink. And the human health effects of PFAS are currently a very active area of research where we continue to learn more information all the time. But current peer-reviewed research does show that exposure to elevated levels of PFAS has been correlated with impacts like high blood pressure, developmental effects in children, increased risk of some cancers, potentially like prostate, kidney, and testicular cancer, and reduced vaccine response. So what the research has shown is that sensitive populations like industrial workers, pregnant women, and children seem to have the highest levels of risk. And children can be exposed to these compounds through their mother's breast milk or in utero. So this past March, the EPA determined that two of the legacy PFAS compounds that we know the most about, those are PFOS and PFOA. You'll hear a lot of acronyms today, but those are two to keep in mind, are likely to be carcinogenic to humans. And this is based on extensive research and demonstrates that the human health risks from PFAS, though still an area of active research, need to be taken seriously.
So a couple things, and maybe I'll go back to you, Matt. PFAS refers to a group of different chemicals, and Carly just noted two of them. Like, how many are there, and what is it about PFAS that this group that is common for all of these different chemicals?
Yeah, that's a great question. Do we need to be
concerned about all of them or just PFOA? Give us some context there.
Sure. So the chemistry that went into creating what we think of as our traditional PFAS, the PFOS and PFOA that Carly mentioned, was a very dirty process. It created a lot of different molecules. Essentially, you take an organic molecule and hydrogen fluoride, and then you zap it with an electric charge. That changes molecules and creates all kinds of different things. We're finding out there's probably thousands of different PFAS in the environment now because of this. That's what was produced by the chemical manufacturers for industrial and residential and commercial use. We also have fluorinated compounds that have been created for, say, pesticides and drugs. Those generally have many fewer fluorines per molecule and tend not to be as great of an environmental or human health concern. But the legislation is sort of catching up with what we've created, which kind of leads into the whole business of how we regulate chemicals in the United States. So we have three main laws on the books. The first one is what we call TSCA, or Toxic Substances Control Act. And that basically says, look, don't produce anything unless you know it's safe. Or if you know something's bad, don't produce it. That never really worked. In the entire history of it, it has never prevented a chemical from coming to market. It was recently revised 5 or 6 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, under what's called the Frank Lautenberg something Act. But it's basically what we call TSCA, or TSCA 2.0. So beyond that, if you create a chemical that's toxic, then we have what's called RCRA. Basically that is the act that tells us, if you create a chemical, here's how you should dispose of it. And then our last sort of law is CERCLA, or what we call Superfund. If you produced a chemical that's bad, if you didn't dispose of it properly, and here it is contaminated, here's how to clean it up, and here's who has to pay for it. All of these 3 laws came out of the environmental movement in 1970, right? That was the creation of the EPA, and that's when we got all of the initiation of our environmental laws. These molecules predate all of that. And so we created them for a long time. They're sort of grandfathered in, they get out into the environment, and now we have to deal with them.
Mhm.
Those are the ones we're really concerned about.
Okay. And which of them are still being manufactured and which are not being manufactured now?
Great question. So I mentioned the early 2000s when these molecules were being found everywhere, right? So PFOS and PFOA were the 8 carbon chain length compounds were the ones that we were finding everywhere, all over the globe. Okay, didn't expect them to be there. So what the manufacturers did is take and cut that molecule in half and make it much smaller. The idea behind that being these longer chain molecules will accumulate in our bodies, in our systems. It takes years for us to eliminate them. The idea of going a smaller molecule is we eliminate them much quicker, and hopefully we won't have as many toxicological problems. We're, again, catching up with what's being produced to try and figure out what the implications are for human health, ecosystem health, and how they move through the environment. Good.
Okay, that's great. I'm just going to give you a minute to talk. You mentioned we're catching up. Talk about the precautionary principle and how well TSCA has worked or is working.
Yeah, so I talk to my students about this all the time. The way TSCA works is, and the new TSCA is even more complicated. They're trying to put more and more regulations on the manufacturer to prove that these chemicals are safe. They're requiring the manufacturers to do all of that testing. One of the downsides of that is we lose chemical innovation from a small business standpoint. It's only the big chemical companies can then afford to do the chemical testing to be able to produce new chemicals. And so there's 2 sides to this, trying to protect things and trying to push the cost onto producers. That's just a little downside. But what we've done in this country, so in Europe is they use what's called the precautionary principle. Prove that it's safe before we produce it, okay? In the United States, we say, okay, produce it until we figure out it's bad, and then we'll stop making it and try and clean it up. Now, that has led to a massive amount of economic wealth and creation of new chemicals, and that's what the United States has opted towards. The precautionary principle probably much more protective of the environment. The way the United States has done it, probably much more protective of capitalism for obvious reasons.
Good, thanks for that background. Let's talk a little bit more about the regulatory environment, Carly, because we've got all of the laws that Matt just mentioned are federal. There's also the state that has authority to regulate how these chemicals are used, manufactured here in Minnesota. And then we have different agencies that are involved. So can you sort of just lay out that map for us?
Yeah, so if I may, because it's a complicated regulatory landscape, I did create a chart for us to look at as we think through this. So I'm going to share my slides here.
Great.
Can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Start the slideshow. Okay. So I have a diagram here to think through some of the different ways that we regulate contaminants that pose a risk to the environment or human health. So as Dr. Simcik said, we're in a bit of a game of catch up when it comes to PFAS, which really is one of the emergent contaminants of our time. So on the left-hand column here, I've outlined some of the tools that we have at both the federal and the state level to regulate contaminants for the risks that they pose to humans in drinking water. So at the federal level, we have the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is under the Environmental Protection Agency or the EPA. And Under the Safe Drinking Water Act, the EPA can set what are called maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs, which are enforceable standards that water utilities across the country must meet. So they must treat their water in order to meet these maximum contaminant levels when they've been finalized. And this past spring, in March of 2023, the EPA proposed maximum contaminant levels for 6 PFAS compounds. So those 2 that we've already mentioned, PFOS and PFOA, PFOS and PFOA, which the EPA determined, as I already mentioned, are likely to be carcinogenic to humans. And then also for 4 other newer, some of those shorter chain, newer PFAS compounds that Dr. Simcik just mentioned. So if these proposed rules are finalized, they will become those enforceable standards for water utilities across the country. At the state level, the state agency that enforces the Safe Drinking Water Act here in Minnesota is the Minnesota Department of Health. And in addition to enforcement of those maximum contaminant levels under the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Minnesota Department of Health can also promulgate health-based guidance values and health risk limits, which are promulgated under the Groundwater Protection Act. And Minnesota has health-based guidance for 6 PFAS compounds, which include PFOS and PFOA. And those are currently under review based on the proposed federal maximum contaminant levels. So then we also have the Clean Water Act at the federal level and with delegated authority to the states. So the 2 main ways to regulate pollutants under the Clean Water Act are, number 1, to set water quality standards that establish pollutant limits based on the designated uses of the water body. And second, the primary permit of the Clean Water Act is the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, or the NPDES permit, it's often called. And that regulates how much of a pollutant can be discharged into surface waters like lakes, rivers, and streams. So Minnesota, here in Minnesota, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has delegated authority under the Clean Water Act to issue water quality standards and to administer the NPDES permit system. So at the state level, this past year, the Minnesota legislature mandated that the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency must develop Class 1 water quality standards, which mean for PFAS, by January 2026. And Class 1 means that it will be levels that will protect drinking water, the use of water bodies for drinking water. So that process has just gotten underway with a request for comments that ended on October 30th, and MCEA did submit a comment to the agency. And at the federal level, in terms of the NPDES permit system, we don't yet have any federal effluent limitation guidelines for PFAS that would establish the amounts of pollution reduction that can be achieved through available treatment technologies. But in the meantime, the EPA has recommended other ways for states to address PFAS contamination, specifically from wastewater treatment plants that I'll go over later. And then finally, biosolids, which are also known as sewage sludge, are a product of the wastewater treatment process. We'll go into this a little bit more in a second here, but it's a chemically treated byproduct that is land applied on crop fields as a fertilizer. And biosolids are one of the pathways for PFAS contamination that we focused in on our report. And I also wanted to explain how those are regulated. So at the federal level, we have federal standards for the use and disposal of sewage sludge that establish pollutant limits and best management practices to protect public health and the environment. And there are currently pollutant limits for 9 heavy metals at the federal level and no limits for PFAS. But the EPA is in the midst of a risk assessment for PFOS and PFOA in sewage sludge, which is anticipated to come out in winter 2024. So about a year from now. And then finally, states can set stricter limits and requirements for other pollutants in their own sewage sludge management rules. And we'll talk today about some states that have done that for PFAS. But Minnesota does not have pollutant limits for PFAS or any requirements to test biosolids for PFAS in our state level rules.
Great, thanks, Carly. that was really a lot. I want to remind people that if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the Q&A, which is down the bottom of your screen in the middle. And I'll monitor those. I see a couple of questions in the chat. The first about groundwater. Groundwater is considered a class 1 water. So when Carly's talking about water quality standards for class 1 water, that's drinking water, that includes groundwater. Carly, there's another question here. What do we know about the risks of casual contact with PFAS through eating fish, for example, or recreating in waters that are contaminated? You want to take that?
I can initially take it and say one of the tools that we have to assess risk from consumption of fish is fish consumption advisories. And we do have fish consumption advisories for PFAS for water bodies across the state of Minnesota. Those are developed by the Minnesota Department of Health. And most recently, we had a new fish consumption advisory issued for Pool 2 of the Mississippi River, which is the section of the river that runs through St. Paul down to basically Lake Rebecca. So the main tool that we have to assess risks to human health from fish consumption is those fish consumption advisories. And I would recommend that you look at the list of fish consumption advisories we have from the Minnesota Department of Health. There's also a fish consumption advisory for Lake Superior.
And then, I don't know, is it true, Matt and Carly, that there isn't really evidence that, recreating in a lake that has PFAS contamination would be a conduit to being contaminated yourself?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
There really is, there's not much concern there's no concern for wading in water that may be containing it.
Okay. Again, folks, I want to ask you to put your questions in the Q&A. There's a little button that says Q&A rather than the chat. Let's go on here to talk about the report that you all put together and the research that you conducted this summer. Carly, maybe you can introduce the report. Why was it important for you in the water program at MCEA to look at the report that you've got?
Yeah, so we really think that, as we've discussed up until now, we're sort of in a game of catch up with PFAS. And there's a lot of activity that's happened. I have more information I can share on the current status at the federal level and the state level. But we really think that a focus on wastewater streams as a primary pathway for PFAS contamination in our water bodies is a really important next step to build on the source reduction laws that we passed this past legislative session here in Minnesota. And that's for two reasons that are really illustrated through these maps. So the first is that there are many classes of industries that are themselves suspected dischargers of PFAS. And those are in the map on the left-hand side of the screen here. So those include industries that have been designated as known users of PFAS in their manufacturing process. Those are the red dots. Airports, which have previously been required to use firefighting foam product that has PFAS. Industrial sites that are suspected users of PFAS, landfills and waste disposal facilities, and sewage and waste treatment plants. So a lot of these industries that are themselves suspected dischargers of PFAS send their wastewater to wastewater treatment plants to be treated and processed. And our wastewater treatment plants don't currently have the technologies to remove PFAS because of all those characteristics that Dr. Simcik discussed, that carbon-fluorine bond that is one of the strongest bonds in organic chemistry that really sets these compounds apart and has also made them useful to industry. Also means that our current wastewater treatment technologies aren't able to remove them from wastewater streams. So we did this report that focuses on wastewater streams as the next place where we really need to, the next frontier of the work on PFAS contamination in Minnesota. And the second reason is illustrated in this map on the right-hand side, and that's biosolids. And biosolids are, as I said before, they're a waste product of the wastewater treatment process that is land applied on crop fields as fertilizer. And if there's PFAS in the wastewater, there's PFAS in the biosolids. And in fact, the concentrations of certain PFAS like PFOS and PFOA can be much higher in the biosolids than they are in the wastewater that comes into the plant. So as you can see on this map, biosolids are land applied across greater Minnesota. So we thought that in particular was a really important wastewater stream to focus on in this report.
Thanks, Carly.
And
Matt, you want
if
to
I
talk
could,
a-
yeah,
Go
if I
ahead.
could just
Yep.
expand on that, it's more than just the carbon fluorine bond being an issue. Wastewater treatment plants' jobs are to get rid of organic matter. They have three major things they're trying to get rid of: organic matter, solids, and pathogens. And these things are present at very high levels in our waste stream. And if we just let that waste stream go directly to a river or a lake, one, that organic matter is going to get chewed up by the biology there, but it's going to take up all the oxygen and kill all the fish. And it's going to release pathogens into the environment that we don't want out there. And it's going to hit it with a very high load of particles. The problem with PFAS and other things like personal care products and pharmaceuticals, they're present at such low concentration, it's very hard to remove them from the waste stream because we're trying to get rid of this large amount of contamination that's coming from our waste stream. And so they're really designed, they're doing what they're designed to do. We just don't have a way of, what we need is new technology to help remove both these micro pollutants as well as these macro pollutants that we're removing.
Why the focus on wastewater? I mean, is that the main way that PFAS are getting into the environment?
Carly,
Can
if you
talk
want to go to
little bit
my
about the different.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll show a slide really quickly, Dr. Simcik, and then I'll hand it to you and go to the
Sure.
diagram that you
Okay.
created. So I want to show this quickly. It's a very useful diagram from the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality that shows why wastewater streams are so critical as a pathway for PFAS contamination to our water bodies. So, MCEA is an environmental law nonprofit, so we wanted to look at the legal tools that are available to address this problem. And this diagram shows some of the tools that are available under the Clean Water Act, namely pollution limits under that NIPDES permit. So if you look at the arrow here, from the wastewater treatment plant, discharges directly into surface water bodies like rivers and lakes, right? So we have pollution limits that we can put into NIPDES permits. And then we also have what are called industrial pretreatment programs, IPP here, which require the industrial dischargers that are themselves suspected or known users of PFAS to put local limits in place or best management practices in place at the facility scale to remove PFAS or reduce PFAS in the wastewater before it gets sent to the wastewater treatment plant, where there's a much larger volume of wastewater to deal with and to treat. So it can be much more.
Carly, I'm just going to interrupt you for a second because we have a couple of questions related to that more upstream removal.
Okay.
Folks wondering, well, why are we focused on wastewater as opposed to the industry itself? And can you talk at all a little bit more about the regulatory context and getting at the industrial polluters as opposed to the public wastewater facility?
Yeah, so really the best tool that we have for that under the Clean Water Act is these industrial pretreatment programs, which are part of that National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System or NIPDES permit. And I think it's illustrated really nicely in this diagram because you may have pollutant levels, like a numeric limit for a certain pollutant in your NIPDES permit. So here in this example, it's 12 parts per trillion PFOS, right? But if you have those limits, the wastewater treatment plant itself has the authority to require industrial pretreatment programs of the industrial users that send their wastewater to the wastewater treatment plant. So that's a really effective tool. You can set these industrial pretreatment program or IPP local limits on the industrial discharger so that they can pre-treat, use treatment technologies or best management practices to remove PFAS at the facility scale, where the concentration it can be much more concentrated and more cost effective to remove at that scale before it gets sent to a wastewater treatment plant and becomes more of a taxpayer burden to remove. So this diagram, I think, is a useful tool to think through why these tools under the Clean Water Act are really important.
Thanks.
And Dr. Simcik, I will move to your diagram and hand it to you.
Yeah, I think I like this diagram because it shows the scope of the problem. So if you look at the top, these are all the multitude of uses for, well, it's not all encompassing, but here are several examples of the uses of these chemicals. As I mentioned before, used in firefighting foam. They're used in microwave popcorn bags, French fry, food wrappers, cosmetics to make waterproof cosmetics, stain and water protectant for your clothing and carpeting, and also industrial. So it's not just the industrial users or producers that are the problem here. We're all using it. They're ubiquitous in the environment of uses. Now, from there, what do we do with our material? We send it to a wastewater treatment plant or a landfill, or it can go directly into our land and water through improper disposal practices. So the reason we're focusing on the wastewater treatment plant, or the reason I focus on the wastewater treatment plant and landfill, is this is the narrowing of the flow of PFAS. We use them everywhere. They go through our waste stream, and then they end up back out everywhere. So let's deal with them where we can have our hands on them. And that's why I'm pushing for what we really need is new technologies to try and tackle them in these narrowing, the bottleneck, if you will, in the flow from use to environmental contamination.
Great, that's really helpful. Okay, let's talk about the study that you did over the summer. Matt, you want to set that up and talk a little bit about what you were trying to achieve with that?
Sure. So the issue here, again, looking at it in terms of a wastewater treatment plant as being one of these flow paths of PFAS. One, they can flow directly into our receiving waters. Again, the wastewater treatment plant is designed to get rid of organic matter, pathogens, and particles. The PFAS can flow through. They'll partition between the dissolve phase and the sludge. So the effluent will be the dissolve phase going out, contaminating our receiving waters with things like PFAS, as well as pharmaceuticals, personal care products, everything that we use on a daily basis and flush down our drains, okay? When it absorbs to the activated sludge, it gets turned into biosolids. That biosolids is used for land application in agricultural and municipal fields as a soil amendment. Those contaminants then can repartition out of that biosolids into the water, percolate down into the groundwater or into a watershed of a river. So what we chose to do was sample 2 spots on the Mississippi River, one in the outflow channel of the wastewater treatment plant and upstream, to look at the difference in contamination, the concentration in what's coming out of the plant versus what is in the river proper, to give ourselves an idea of what type of chemicals and at what levels are we seeing these things come out of the plant. Then we wanted to look at areas where biosolids are being readily applied. And so there's areas in St. Cloud where a lot of fields are getting biosolids applications. And so we chose 2 rivers that received quite a bit of biosolids application in their watershed, and one river, the Sauk River, that didn't have biosolids application permits that we're aware of. And so in doing that, we wanted to look at, okay, what do the rivers look like in watersheds that have biosolids application versus one that wouldn't? And what we found, if we go to the concentration slide, if you look on the left there, those are the concentrations of total PFAS of the compounds that we looked at, a total of, I think it was, I can't remember the actual number.
19, I think.
19, thank you. 19 PFAS. And these are acids, sulfonates, and some precursor compounds of fluorotelmer sulfonates. We added them all up and looked at them, and you can see that the outlet from the wastewater treatment plant, this is a log scale, so concentration in nanograms per liter on the y-axis, and you can see the biggest bar is coming out of the wastewater treatment plant. Not surprising. Again, we use these things everywhere. They end up in our waste stream and they end up out into the environment. The Mississippi River, about an order of magnitude lower than what we're seeing coming out of in concentration, not in flow. There's much more mass in the Mississippi River because you have a huge amount of flow going through. Looking at the St. Cloud rivers, the highest are Clearwater Creek, and then Lower Johnson Creek, and then our reference site of the Sauk River. If we look at the individual rivers, oh no, stay on that one, sorry. If we look at the individual PFOS and PFOA from our St. Cloud rivers, all our rivers, you see again that the Clearwater Creek is highest for PFOS and PFOA from that biosolids application, lower even or higher even than what we're seeing coming out of the outlet of the wastewater treatment plant. Again, not surprising. We've stopped making these. We've stopped using these for the most part, PFOS and PFOA, and so we should expect to see that come down in our wastewater effluent. And then, of course, the lowest one we see here is our Sauk River reference site.
Say a little bit more there, Matt, about why is it not coming down in the Clearwater Creek? Because
so that's
the biosolid for a while. It takes
right. So if you look at that slide that showed all of the biosolids application, the time at which those biosolids were applied could have been a period of time when PFOS was still in use and still highly prevalent. Excuse me, easy for me to say. Okay, it takes time for those chemicals to leach from those biosolids and into the creek. And so it's just taking time for that to flush the system and get those things further downstream and away from where they were applied, but not removed from the environment.
Okay.
So the wastewater treatment plant is more of a snapshot in time of what we're using now, and the biosolids application is more of a historical picture of what we've been using. Okay, now we go on to the next one. And so if we look at we've separated now out the St. Cloud on the left and the Mississippi on the right. These are just looking at the five. There are 6 compounds for which we have MCLs proposed. We didn't look at GenX. We just looked at PFOA, PFOS, perfluorononanoic acid, hexane sulfonate, and the butane sulfonate. And again, you see Clearwater Creek exceeding the 4 part per million or 4 nanogram per liter proposed MCL in almost all of the compounds, and our Sauk River being much lower. Johnson Creek also pretty low in some of these compounds. And so something going on there in terms of what the biosolids that are being applied there. If we look at the Mississippi River, what we see coming out of the wastewater treatment plant is mostly the perfluorobutane sulfonate. Again, this is a log scale, so this is orders of magnitude higher. Again, manufacturing shifted from an 8 carbon chain length compounds to 4 carbon chain compounds. This is the 4 carbon chain length compound. And so it makes sense that we would see that coming out of the wastewater treatment plant, because that's more of what we're seeing currently in use in the environment. Now, moving forward to 2025 or 2030, when these things are no longer going to be produced, we hope to see those things come down. Again, I'd like to capture these when they're going through the wastewater treatment plant before they get back out in the environment. So it'd be really nice to try and spur research on removal technologies for these.
There is a question in the chat about removal technologies and whether or not anything even exists at the moment.
Well, we've been working on technology in my laboratory. We have some technology that works quite well for groundwater. We're trying to apply it to wastewater. It doesn't, again, carbon fluorine bond extremely strong. We don't destroy them. What we're trying to do is capture it. We're trying to drive the compounds into the biosolids, because then we can deal with them in the biosolids easier. And we're actually hopeful that if we can bind them strongly enough in those biosolids, perhaps they won't be bioavailable, meaning they won't go up into crops or leach out into our surface waters again. So we're working on it, but my hope is now that we have an MCL, there's going to be a lot more people thinking about this and a lot more people working on it, because it's more than one person could do. And there's a lot more people out there that are much smarter than I am. And hopefully we'll be able to figure out how to destroy this stuff in place where we have it.
Okay. Good. Thanks for your work on that and for describing the study for us. Again, folks, this is all written up in a report that we're publishing today, and it's on our website, which is www.mncenter.org. You can find the full report there and read it. Let's see, we are getting close to the time where I'd like to get to some questions, but Carly, before we do that, I want to know from you, after studying this and seeing the results of the report, and looking at the regulatory landscape, what the recommendations are that MCEA and you have put together for some policy changes.
Yeah, I would be happy to cover that. So I want to briefly, really quickly here, part of our report that'll be up on the website for people to take a look at is we looked at what approaches other states have taken to address PFAS in wastewater streams, and we found some really proactive approaches that some other states have taken, which is outlined here on this slide. And one shared quality across these approaches is that when states have tested for PFAS in wastewater effluent, that again is the treated wastewater that is discharged from the plant into surface water bodies. And when wastewater treatment plants have tested biosolids for PFAS, they have found PFAS. So we know that these wastewater streams are a pathway for PFAS contamination. And then they've used some of those tools that we discussed earlier on, especially under the Clean Water Act, to address PFAS contamination in those wastewater streams. So in Vermont, for example, all biosolids must be tested at least annually for PFAS substances. And then soil, groundwater, and plant tissue must also be tested for PFAS at certain facilities that land apply biosolids. And in Michigan, biosolids must be tested prior to land application. So states like Maine, Vermont, and Michigan, they all have these requirements to test for PFAS in biosolids. In some cases, like Maine, they have banned land application of biosolids, or Wisconsin has developed an interim strategy for biosolids that bans land application if the biosolids test above a certain threshold of PFAS. And then Michigan and North Carolina are examples of states that have written explicit PFAS limits into those NIPD's wastewater discharge permits to require the use of pretreatment programs to reduce PFAS with great success. So, what have we done here in Minnesota, and where can we improve? So here in Minnesota, we don't currently have mandatory PFAS pollution control terms like limits, numerical limits, written into municipal wastewater permits. For some permit renewals, like the Metropolitan Wastewater Treatment Plant in St. Paul, the agency has said it will consider numerical limits for PFAS when it renews the permit. But largely, the state has taken a voluntary approach. There's a voluntary memorandum of understanding that MPCA has sent to certain wastewater treatment facilities to ask them to monitor their influent. And that's the wastewater that comes into the facility for treatment. And then the idea is that if they monitor their influent, they can identify the industrial users that contribute PFAS to the wastewater collection system. This is a good start, but it misses some critical steps, which is what we really chose to focus on in our recommendations, because it does not require those facilities to test the effluent, which is the treated wastewater that's discharged into water bodies like Lake Superior or the Mississippi River here in the Twin Cities. And it also doesn't require facilities to test biosolids, which are land applied on crop fields across the state and can be a pathway for soil and groundwater contamination.
So let me stop you there, Carly, because we've had a number of questions about this, just to kind of emphasize what you've just said. in their permits, at least, there are no monitoring requirements for the discharge of PFAS and the effluent that's being discharged from any wastewater facility here in the state of Minnesota. Is that accurate?
Not for municipal wastewater treatment plants, correct. The agency is writing in numerical limits for the 3M Cottage Grove facility, so the industrial facility. And like I said, they've said that they will consider numerical limits for some permit renewals.
So, and I'm talking about just monitoring, regardless of limits. Sometimes there's a monitoring requirement in the permit, even when there's not a limit. But at the moment, we're not requiring monitoring.
Correct. There's the voluntary memorandum of understanding.
Okay. And that applies also to the biosolids?
Well, the voluntary MOU doesn't have any requirements to look at the effluent, the treated wastewater that's discharged, or at biosolids. Just, it's focused only on the influent, which is the wastewater that comes into the facility to be treated.
Okay. Thanks. Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to get out because I've seen a number of questions about that.
Right. So here's a preview of some of our recommendations. And again, I would really encourage people to take a look at the report on our website. We have packed a lot of information and a lot of acronyms into a really short period of time here. So I would encourage people to take some time with the report. But basically at the state level, you know, we covered those different regulations under the Clean Water Act and specifically for biosolids earlier on in the presentation. But at the state level, agencies like the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and state legislatures can enact stricter regulations for biosolids than what currently exists at the federal level. So, you know, one of our recommendations is to add PFAS as a pollutant under the Minnesota sewage sludge management rules, which would lead to requirements to monitor and treat. Or, you know, at the very least, we should begin to require that wastewater treatment facilities test and monitor biosolids that are intended for land application for PFAS substances that pose a risk to human health. So that's the second bullet point here, require wastewater treatment plants to monitor not just the influent and not just a voluntary approach, but require them to monitor influent, effluent, and land applied biosolids for PFAS, so we can better understand the scope of contamination. And then really to use those numerical limits in the permits, the NIPD's permits, as a tool that then allows the wastewater treatment facilities to require these pre-treatment programs on those industrial users that require them to use best management practices and treatment options to reduce and remove PFAS from industrial wastewater before it reaches municipal wastewater treatment plants. And then I'm going to jump to the last bullet point here. Another recommendation is to investigate certain sites where biosolids have been land applied for decades for legacy soil and groundwater contamination, the likes of which have been discovered in other states like Michigan and Maine, and have even forced some farms to close down because of the extent of the contamination. So we have several other recommendations also that are in the report, but I think I'll end it here so that we have time for some questions, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay, great. Thanks, Carly. So there have been several questions, Matt, about the uptake of PFAS in crops and the foods that we maybe eat. And is that also one of the ways in which these are getting into people's bodies? What do we know about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, a lot of the biosolids get applied to agricultural fields. That makes it up into the crop, whether that crop is eaten by us or eaten by animals that we then eat. The PFAS doesn't go away. It follows right up to you. And so it's certainly a concern. There's been quite a bit of interest in the scientific community of looking at how this works and how we can try and prevent it. So again, hopefully with the more attention this gets, hopefully the more money flows to trying to figure out how to solve this problem.
Can you talk also, Matt, about how
Wait,
you
hang on.
said
I just saw a comment in the in the chat that said pretty good reason to eat organic food. Organic food has biosolids application to the field, so don't kid yourself there.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's true. You mentioned when you were talking about the precautionary principle, the difference between regulation in Europe and here. There's a question about PFAS in Europe. I mean, are they using alternatives there? Is PFAS actually banned in Europe? What are some of the alternatives? Can we learn anything from the European experience?
Yeah, great question. I wish I knew more about the regulations going on in Europe. I do know that the regulations around, at least around PFAS, were much stricter early on. And this is sort of one of the sort of upsides to globalization, is that if you're a global company and you're producing stuff all over the world and you're hit with a really hard regulation in one area, you tend to just employ that practice everywhere. And so, you know, having stricter standards in Europe, I think probably benefited us over here as well. But I can't tell you. I don't know exactly what's going on in terms of what they're producing.
Okay. Carly, somebody's wondering whether there might be a list of counties or locations of industry that either produce or use a lot of PFAS. And I think that EPA has something like that. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, there have been, I believe, 50 different classes of industries that have been identified at the EPA level, and and also through a group called the Environmental Working Group, as industries that are known or suspected users of PFAS that would likely have PFAS in their wastewater. So I would recommend a report from the Environmental Working Group, which outlines what those different industry classes are and maps them across the United States, so you can look at individual states. And we also have a map. Thank you very much to Hudson, who put a link in the chat there. And we have one of those maps. We have a statewide map of those known or suspected users of PFAS in the report that we published today as well.
Okay. Matt, if you can take the PFAS out of the effluent or, prevent it from getting into the biosolids, what do we do with it?
Right. So, right. So this is where driving it into the biosolids is actually a good thing, because again, then we can control it, right? The water. Wastewater treatment plants, at least if you look at the Metro plant, it's something like 50 to 100 million gallons of water a day. There's not much you can do with that. But when you get it down into something that you can put in a dump truck, now you can deal with it. Whether that be putting it in a confined landfill or incinerating it at a high enough temperature to destroy these things, which is very, very difficult to do, I will add. That's where we want it, because then we can deal it. That's why I'm saying we really need technologies to try and deal with it when it's in that biosolid form, because then we can actually get rid of this for good. If we don't want it in the biosolids, we're going to have it in the effluent, and that's not where we want it either.
Yeah. There are a number of questions about sort of the health consequences and what we really know. So I think that it would be good to hear from both of you about that. I mean, there's references to cancer risk, other things, but what is the state of the epidemiology, and do we need to learn more? Obviously, we probably need to learn more, but maybe you can address that.
Well, what I will say is that there has been, up to this point, much more extensive animal laboratory studies about the impacts of different PFAS compounds. So, for example, for PFBS, the EPA has a toxicity assessment that focuses on impacts to thyroid function that were identified in animal laboratory studies. And the epidemiological studies to look at human impacts are newer and underway. And like I said at the start, we continue to learn more information. But the EPA did feel like there was enough data and enough research to identify both PFOS and PFOA as likely to be carcinogenic in the proposed maximum contaminant levels that it issued in March of 2023. So, at a minimum, that's enough to say that we need to continue to look at the human health impacts of these compounds, not just the legacy ones like PFOS and PFOA, but the newer ones that continue to be used and continue to be circulated through the environment. And that we need to take the potential for human health impact seriously.
Matt, do you want to say anything about that?
Well, no. I want to get back to the biosolids application in organic food, because it's creating an entire conversation in and of itself in the chat. So several things. Number one, regulations on organic foods is recent. Biosolids application is historic. And so the field on which you're growing your crops, you may not apply biosolids necessarily, but there may have been biosolids applied there in the past. So what I'm saying is that's not necessarily a protection. I had colleagues that back in the 90s and in 2000s, when organic food was first coming into vogue, actually buying organic food and non-organic food and analyzing it in the lab and showing the same amount of pesticides in both, right? So for a long time there was no. It was a labeling. It was a greenwashing of the produce, and so you have to be very, very careful with that. I actually called into an NPR program in Chicago one time when I was driving through. I did pull over to call in, but they had experts talking about how it was safe to put biosolids on fields now because we've gotten rid of PCBs, and we understand how to deal with metals and things, and so we're not worried about things being taken up. And I called in to say, no, you have to worry about PFAS because these things are mobile; they will get up into the crops. And so if it makes you feel better to eat organic food, that's fine, but don't think of it that you're saving yourself exposure from PFAS necessarily, because again, they're everywhere. We've used them everywhere. They've ended up in our environment.
Okay.
Now the major source is drinking water still. I will say that. And when Carly was talking about the fish, when you guys got off on that, there was a recent study just came out this summer that showed that fish actually is a much more a significant source than we originally had assumed, and so that is an issue as well. But it goes everywhere. The chemicals we used to worry about, things like I mentioned, PCBs and DDT, they really like to stick to fat. And so when we had fish consumption advisories in Minnesota for PCBs, if you remove the fat along the back and the fat along the lateral line and the belly fat, you could remove a lot of the PCBs. Okay, mercury, we can't do that. It goes into the meat of the fish. PFAS binds to the blood in the fish. It's very difficult to remove this from the way you clean or cook or prepare the food. And so it can be difficult.
Okay. Well, we obviously could continue talking about this for another hour, I think, but we're about out of time. Before folks sign off, I just have one last thing that I want to mention, which is that you all are really the reason that we can do this work, and we rely on you and your support. And it happens to be next week that there is Give to the Max Day. Oh, how convenient for us. You don't have to wait for Give to the Max Day to sign up to be a supporter of MCEA. But certainly on November 16th, next week, if you can think about us when you're going through the organizations that you're donating to, that would be great. We would really appreciate it. There are lots of ways to give. You will find a big green donate button on our website if you go there. So we really appreciate it. And we do need your support to do this kind of important work. So I want to say thank you to Dr. Simcik, and thank you to Carly. Carly, what do you want to say?
I just wanted to quickly say, just a reminder, the report's up on MCEA's website, and also MCEA will issue action alerts about potential legislative action related to these issues in the year ahead. And then finally, we will partner with Clean Water Action to do a town hall event in St. Cloud this winter. So some of the samples we conducted were in St. Cloud. So we're going to do some outreach in St. Cloud this winter as well. And then finally, I wanted to mention there's a state-funded study into the impacts of biosolids land application on PFAS uptake in plants, which is expected out next summer. So if people want to learn more, I would encourage you to use some of those different channels that I just mentioned.
Great, thanks. Look for those upcoming events and reports. Again, thank you too for participating, and thank you to all of you folks out there in the audience. Thanks for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.